Good morning, everyone. My name is Trudy Russo. I work in the Chancellor Patterson Library. I am the Special Collections Librarian. I'm also a liaison librarian. Part of my responsibility as the Special Collection Librarian is to look after a variety of special collections here in the Chancellor Patterson Library. But the one that brings us all here today is the Lakehead University Faculty Monograph Collection. I'm so excited for all of you to hear the words of our panelists who will be talking about their incredible research and the books that they've published. And I know we're very much looking forward to that. Today, we're going to be celebrating 4 different books. 2 of the books were co-authored. The collection contains books that are either written, edited, or illustrated by Lakehead University faculty members. And each of the 4 books will have 10 minutes. So the faculty members will be discussing their research. And then there's 5 minutes allocated for questions. So for those who are joining us as attendees today, you will note that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A or question and answer. So if you have any questions that you'd like to put forward to the faculty members, please put it in the Q&A. And so before we get started, I'd like to introduce our university librarian. His name is Mr. Robin Canuel, and he has a few words he'd like to say.
Good morning. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to welcome everyone to this session and to celebrate our faculty's monographic publishing achievements. I would like to congratulate all of our authors for these significant achievements and for their important contributions to research. I want to also take this opportunity to say a big thank you to both Trudy Russo and Sheena Allard for all of their hard work organizing this session, and to thank Trudy for her ongoing efforts to develop our faculty-authored monograph collection. The iteration between research and teaching and research and practice is incredibly powerful. Faculty teaching is often influenced by their research, and their teaching often influences the development of their research programs. Given this reality, it is extremely important for us to actively collect faculty publications of all types so that our students can easily access their professors' publications. At last count, we are approaching almost 1 million monographs in our collections, which includes both physical and electronic titles. However, I would suggest one of our most important special collections is the faculty-authored monograph collection located on the 5th floor of the Chancellor Patterson Library in the Teaching Commons space. I would also like to express my gratitude to our 6 distinguished faculty here with us today for their willingness to participate in today's session, highlighting aspects of their research and their published books. I've been really looking forward to this morning's session. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Trudy.
Great, thank you, Robin. So we're going to begin today, and the first title that which I have in my hands here that we're going to be hearing about is Civil Society and Social Movements in Food System Governance. And this book was edited by Dr. Charles Lefko. Dr. Lefko is the Canada Research Chair in Equitable and Sustainable Food Systems, the Director of the Sustainable Food Systems Lab, and an Associate Professor in the Department of Health Sciences here at Lakehead University. The university was very fortunate to have Dr. Lefko join us in 2016. His community-engaged research uses a food systems lens to better understand the importance of and connections between social justice, ecological regeneration, and regional economics and active democratic engagement. And just a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions for Dr. Lefko, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom. And I very much look forward to hearing about his research.
Great, thanks, Trudy. If someone can't hear me, maybe just let me know. But I'll just keep going. Assume I'm on mic. Thanks again for the organizers and for putting this together. It's great to be able to share our work, and I'm also excited about hearing more about some of the other books. So I'm here to talk a bit about and say a few words about my latest book, Civil Society, Social Movements, Engagements, and Food Systems Governance, which I co-edited with my colleagues, Peter Andre, Joe Clark, Kristen Lowett. And I just want to say right off the bat, the book is open access. We unfortunately had to pay a lot of money for that, but it was really important to us because the book is co-authored between academic and community partners. We really wanted to make sure it was accessible to those people. So I'll get hopefully someone, yes, it's in the link and it's all there. So you can go to the library and see the hard copy, or you can just click on it and it's all free and available there on the Routledge site. So I want to say quickly, the book evolved from a collaborative project called Food Locally Embedded, Globally Engaged, or FLEDGE, that involved 7 years of evolving research partnerships with more than 130 Canadian, Indigenous, and international participants. So FLEDGE's goal was really to explore how community food initiatives could act as a pillar for regional sustainable transformation. So that was kind of the origins of it. And really a lot of the chapters in the book came out of that work. So I thought I'd take some time today basically to talk a bit about what I mean by participatory food governance, which is really what the book is about, and how it's connected to kind of advocating for a just, healthy, and sustainable food system. So put simply, food systems governance really asks us to consider the ways that food systems are organized and controlled, right? It builds on this kind of place-based work of communities, of organizations, of social movements, to consider the structures and processes of how decisions are made, and most importantly, how power kind of works within those decision-making processes. Food systems, for those of you who are not clear or familiar with that concept, are comprised of this kind of complex, overlapping, multi-sectoral, multi-jurisdictional relationships with varying degrees of engagement. So a food systems lens really considers not just the supply chain, so how food is produced or harvested, processed, sold, disposed of, eaten, but also the kind of myriad of ways that the supply chain impacts issues like climate change, food security, producer-harvester livelihoods, labor rights, Indigenous self-determination. So applying a food systems lens to governance really focuses our attention on the kind of laws, the policies, the regulations, and more importantly, the power dynamics, again, involved and the relationships that shape and influence how we eat, what we eat, and who gets to eat. So for the majority of food producers and harvesters and workers across the food chain, governance is commonly experienced or essentially imposed as a kind of top-down approach that is unduly influenced by a very small group of private sector actors, corporations that hold a very disproportionate amount of power. So this uneven influence really significantly impacts the activities and relationships that can happen within any given food system. And we saw these dynamics play out, we see them all over the place. For those of you who are following the recent UN Food Systems Summit, we really saw this dynamic happen where ostensibly people were brought together to kind of talk about sustainability and equity. But of course, we saw a real kind of domination of corporate interests, corporate philanthropic organizations, and really bypassing existing methods of democratic process. And ultimately, critics described this kind of summit as a governance failure and flagged the faulty assumptions that simply bringing people to the table would result in, equitable engagement. When of course, when you bring a corporation, a government, and a nonprofit organization, or a farmer, or an Indigenous community, there is real power dynamics at play. And there were of course many protests and lots of really important stuff that came out of this from the movements themselves. So going back to the point here, participatory food governance really means confronting these kind of unjust power dynamics, including capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, settler colonialism, that all are kind of at the core of our dominant food system. So coming back then to kind of where I started, to establish a participatory food governance system, we really need to think of these kind of longer term effects of how the food system works, how it can change, and we need to pay attention to governance and collectively the opportunities for collective impact in kind of decision making that can enable or constrain healthy, equitable, sustainable food systems for all. So this brings me, of course, to the book. This is what the book is about. We really aim to examine the kind of opportunities and challenges and implications of a variety of kind of context-specific governance interventions by food movement actors at a whole range of scales. So while many critical scholars focus their energies on identifying what's wrong with the system, which is incredibly important, and specifically with the state, this book really tried to kind of dig a bit deeper and say, how are people responding to that? How are groups responding to that? Again, Indigenous communities, local nonprofits, grassroots organizations, movements. And we developed this kind of food system or food governance continuum, which really focuses on kind of how participation happens, just to kind of as an analytical tool to think through this, which is basically what the book is based on. And we kind of think about food systems governance engagement and exercise of power by social movements on this continuum from at one end to kind of multi-stakeholderism, which is this idea if you put a bunch of people at a table together, there'll be some kind of equity, which is often what happens. And I've already talked a bit about that power dynamic. And on the other end of the continuum, a kind of self-governance or a kind of even polycentrism, right? Where we have chapters that, you know, kind of one of the ones I co-wrote with Chief Dean Sayers of Batchewana First Nations really looks at kind of these struggles for self-determination within kind of food systems and, you know, what they term as Indigenous food sovereignty. So again, the book kind of takes these case studies and looks at them through this continuum. And we ask questions like, or we attempt to answer them at least, around what forms of power do food movements mobilize to assess their position on the continuum? And what are the benefits and limitations associated with these kind of different types of engagement in governance? So basically the first chapter really focuses on kind of laying out this continuum and thinking it through and kind of the kind of theoretical understandings behind it, but also the practical work involved in doing it. And then the remaining 9 chapters are organized again according to the main forms of governance. So chapters 2 through 5 kind of shed light on the intersections between collective action for food systems transformation, again, mostly at the local level, but also through network building. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of cases that really focus again on kind of the challenges and attempts at kind of dealing with this kind of multi-stakeholder-ism at one end of the spectrum. And then chapters 6 through 9 present a kind of a series of diverse case studies that we collectively call kind of experiments in institutionalizing co-governance. So again, I mentioned this chapter with Batchewana First Nations. We have another chapter that I also co-wrote looking at the National Food Policy for Canada that was just released in 2019 and thinking through the kind of opportunities and challenges of that. But more importantly, all the work at a grassroots social movement level that went into building that. So in conclusion, I'll just wrap up with this. Using food, I think, is a lever for social and economic and ecological change. Food movements are really gaining a lot of ground by building relationships of trust, political competency, and as a result are really increasing a kind of claiming role in governance processes. And in some cases, this is part of large historical struggles against capitalism, against settler colonialism. While in other cases, it's about bringing voices, and of course, voices of those most marginalized or who have been vulnerabilized to the fore in policy and governance. And I think, just as a final word, these are really exciting times. You know, despite all of the kind of world, like global challenges and even challenges, you know, locally here in Thunder Bay and everything in between, there's a lot of really powerful people and groups kind of working for change within these systems. And working kind of with food movement actors to kind of chart these pathways forward and reflect on them with the possibilities and limitations presented with those various paths. So that's what the book's about. As I said, it's an open access book. That was a very deliberate decision by the group. I invite you to read the whole thing, read individual chapters if there are things you're interested in, and the link is there. It's also in the library. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
That was incredible, and it's obviously a very very deep research and a very incredible topic. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom. Charles, we do have another 5 minutes that we'd love to hear more about it. So if we don't see any questions, I don't see any at this point. I'd love to hear maybe here at the local level, like what do you see happening here in Thunder Bay in terms of improving availability of food or food security?
Yeah, that's a good question that is not in the book, but I can comment a bit on that as well. And actually, Rebecca Schiff, who's about to present, and I have been working on a project, you know, thinking about that as well. So in Thunder Bay, I mean, there's a whole range of things. I mean, actually, the poster right behind me here is one example of that. This is not the Rebecca Schiff part. I'll get to that one sec. But this is a 13 Moons poster that we created in partnership with 4 Indigenous elders, an Indigenous artist and knowledge keepers. And it kind of looks at the ways that an Indigenous food system kind of functions and, you know, based on this kind of the teachings of the 13 Moons. And we actually have a video, a 30-minute video we just released on that. So that's one example of how we can think about kind of governance, right? And I think the elders and the knowledge keepers really describe this model as a governance tool. So it's not just about what, so you can, I know it's hard to see here, but anyways, I'll put the chat, I'll send the chat in the, I'll put the link in the chat box. But, you know, it's not just about what's available when, but it's really about how kind of, how decisions are made, how power kind of works. And it's really in contrast to something like the Canadian Food Guide or nutritionist, you know, public health guidelines. So, you know, some of it, there's overlap. So I don't want to say it's completely in contrast, but anyways, it's a really interesting model. And I really encourage folks to watch the video, which is mostly elders and knowledge keepers speaking about this. And really, it's kind of an Indigenous food guide for the region. So anyways, I will share that link. The project with Rebecca that we're working on is really thinking about the work of the Thunder Bay Area Food Strategy, which is essentially a food policy council. And, you know, Rebecca and I are doing some social network analysis work of food policy councils across the country, you know, thinking about how, you know, these groups of people that get together really from across the spectrum. So on the Thunder Bay Area Food Strategy, we have groups like public health sits on it. The city has counselors that sit on it. I sit on it from the university. We have nonprofits on it, you know, the list goes on. And the idea is for these groups to find a table to get together to have conversations about both the challenges, but also directions forward. So there's, you know, over 40 member organizations, as well as all the regional municipalities have signed on to the Thunder Bay Area Food Charter. And then we have a strategy we're producing. We just produced, just out today actually, is a emergency food plan for the city that looks at kind of food access during the pandemic and kind of what we need to consider for the next pandemic or next emergency. So yeah, so I think those are two examples. One is really Indigenous based and Indigenous focused, and the other one is kind of more of a multi-sector approach to thinking about these issues of food security, but also kind of getting down to those issues of food power and food sovereignty, which is really about the power and decision making, which I would argue is a precursor to even being able to have the conversation about food security. Because how can we expect people to eat and access food if they have no power over the kind of food, over those decisions that get made, and instead we're leaving that completely to corporations or to the state. So anyways, I'll stop there.
Oh, that was incredible. Another question that comes to mind is you had mentioned, you had talked just a tiny bit about, you mentioned climate change. And I was wondering if perhaps you could expand on that for a few minutes. So how that climate change is in effect affecting food security.
Yeah, that's not an easy answer, but I will say that this emergency food plan we created, I mean, part of the reason we thought it was really important, and the food plan was funded by the Thunder Bay Community Foundation, and the city was involved in a bunch of again, organizations and groups as well. And one of the things we are thinking about is exactly this question about, you know, if like there may be another pandemic, it's not unheard of, if this pandemic ever ends. But the other thing is, you know, climate change, we know it's happening. We know it's a thing. We know there's going to be an impact. And that impact is already happening very directly in a lot of, you know, other countries, other places who are much more vulnerable to climate impacts. But it's also affecting Thunder Bay. We've seen impacts with farmers here, with growers, you know, Indigenous people, harvesters have talked about the impact on kind of traditional food practices. And, you know, without getting into the details of that, I'll just say that these are all things that, I mean, one, we need to stop climate change. I think that is the most important thing. And there's lots, you know, lots of good information about what needs to happen at the kind of governance level. But, you know, the other thing is we need to be ready for this. We need to be, you know, have these kind of climate resilient you know, situation or, you know, things in place. And this is part of what the emergency food plan talks about. But again, I think just to maybe just the one thing I will say is this is really, I think, again, a question of governance, right? We are not, you know, we're not going to stop climate change by, you know, switching to, you know, I don't know, more sustainable light bulbs or driving an electric car, you know, or not eating meat. I mean, all those things are important, but those are not the things that are going to have a major impact. What we need to do is think about the kind of regulations, the policies that enable both corporations to get away with really terrible behavior, but also that allow, you know, things like we go to our grocery store and, you know, do we pay you know, $5 for an organic apple or 30 cents for an apple that was grown with pesticides and migrant, you know, unjust labor? And why do we have that choice? Why should we as individual consumers who also have to manage our families and our, you know, increasing gas prices, et cetera, why should we have to decide whether we're going to save the environment or destroy the environment? I mean, those are governance questions that lots of people have spilled a lot of ink on. that there's, anyways. So yes, I would just say that these are governance questions and policy questions that if we really want to change the system, we have to be thinking at a systems level, not just about individual actions. Not that individual actions don't matter. Everyone should go and buy an electric car if you could ever afford it, but you know, and stop or eat less meat. But you know, that's your own personal choice. I think really we need to be thinking about the more structural issues that are at the heart of, you know, again, capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, you know, patriarchy. These are the underlying structures that shape our structure, our system, and create injustice. Anyways, I'll stop there.
That was amazing. I learned so much, and it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. We really very much appreciate it. So thank you. Thank you. So the next book that we're going to be going on to, and I have it here in my hands. We do have it in the library collection. And the next book is Queer Atlantic: Masculinity, Mobility, and the Emergence of Modernist Form. This book was written by Dr. Daniel Hanna. Dr. Hanna is a professor in the Department of English. He joined Lakehead University in 2006. His research and teaching is primarily focused on American and British literature of the 19th century, with a particular interest in transatlantic studies, gender and sexuality, and visual culture. His first monograph was titled Henry James, Impressionism and the Public, and it was published by Ashgate in 2013. He has published articles on a diverse range of authors, including William Blake, Felicia Hemans, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Joseph Conrad. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Hanna, and I very much look forward to what he has to say about his research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trudy. And thanks everybody for coming today. It's great to be here celebrating the research of my talented colleagues. I look forward to hearing more of that after I talk as well. I'm going to begin with a potted synopsis of my book, Queer Atlantic: Masculinity, Mobility, and the Emergence of Modernist Form. The synopsis comes from the introduction. Spanning a period of new imperialism that saw consolidations of British colonial power in Africa and Asia alongside the emergence of the United States as a global force, Queer Atlantic offers a close examination of 5 transatlantic novels written by 5 white men in Britain and America between the years 1886 and 1916. Herman Melville's Billy Budd, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Master of Ballantrae, Henry James's The Golden Bowl, Joseph Conrad's Nostromo, and Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier. Each of these novels centers on the jarring sexual mobility, the gravitational pull and disorienting force of an exceptional man. Evading, anticipating, exceeding others' efforts to account for their erotic charge, each of these men challenges both the interpretive models of other characters and the formal arrangements of their male narrators. By virtue of either their availability to transnational flows of power, their cosmopolitan sensibilities, or their refusal of narrowly national identifications, each of these men also stands in the novel as an intersectional figure between Europe and America. The transitive queer Atlantic becomes in this context a figurative space for exploring and sometimes containing mobilities of gender and desire. Initiating a formal ambivalence that will become key to modernist aesthetics, these novels' experiments with syntax, with structure, and with perspective move between channeling and resisting the challenges posed by their central characters to privileged narratives of national longing and belonging. So that's the synopsis. And I thought I should break it down a little bit. So as the subtitle of my book suggests, mobility is a key concept for this book. And that's for several reasons. It speaks firstly to the transatlantic dimensions of my argument. I'm interested in the shape of narratives about moving across imaginary borders, both geographical and psychological, between European and American forms of living. The kinds of movement across these borders varies widely in the book. I talk about instances of immigration, imperialist expansion, naval excursions, tourism, piracy, and scenes evoking the slave trade and the legacy of its Middle Passage. But I also consider the ways in which plots that depend on a collision of European, usually British, and American social conventions bring out the contingent quality of those conventions, exposing their mobile rather than their fixed status. Mobility also functions as a description of sexuality in these texts, both in terms of sexual identities that queerly refuse to easily fall into recognizable categories, and in terms of the idea of sexuality itself, a concept that at the turn of the 20th century remained far from settled. My argument also queries recent explorations of queer ethics. So Tim Dean describes the theoretical rather than sexual orientation of queerness as a, quote, ethics of alterity, a relational openness to the other. And Jose Esteban Munoz has made the case for the yet-to-be quality of an ideal queerness, accessible only through an ecstasy of, quote, collective potentiality. While my writing follows through the deconstructive tendencies of queer reading, teasing out the inherent instabilities that structure heteronormative fantasies of Anglo-Atlantic masculinity, in doing so, it also points to the strange companionship of queer relationality, an openness to the other, and imperialism, an engulfment of the other. What does it mean, I ask, for a work to evoke a mode of reading that queerly refuses to fix the subject, even as it aligns such an openness to the other as strangely and perhaps unexpectedly pivotal to imperialism's imagining of the other as colonizable? Along these lines, the last strand of mobility in the book, mobility, also describes my overarching critical approach to my material. The very phrase, queer Atlantic, is supposed to evoke a collision between two different critical lenses for reading. And my argument involves constant movement between these frames. So I'm conscious that much of what I'm talking about here might sound kind of abstract, especially if you haven't read the book, which I imagine you haven't. So I thought it would be useful to give an abbreviated example of what this kind of analysis looks like in practice. Unfortunately, that means I have to summarize a different book, a book that I'm talking about. So my third chapter offers a reading of Henry James's The Golden Bowl. And for those of you who haven't read it, spoilers alert, although spoilers aren't all that important if you're reading Henry James. This novel tells the story of Maggie Verver and her widower father, Adam Verver, both filthy rich expatriate Americans living in London. Maggie marries Prince Amerigo, impoverished Italian aristocrat, and then seeks out a new wife for her father, who she fears is going to struggle without her. There's an air of incestuous intimacy about the Ververs, and there's a queer suggestiveness hovering over Adam Verver's interest in Maggie's husband. Maggie encourages her father to marry her friend, Charlotte Stant, without realizing she is her husband's former lover. It's a bit of a soap opera, this novel. Charlotte and the prince engage in an affair in due course, and the rest of the novel, told by a third-person narrator, almost exclusively through Maggie's consciousness, becomes a series of quiet negotiations in which Maggie comes to realize the pair's infidelity, but attempts to keep her father from knowing while restoring her marriage to its former state. The titular Golden Bowl, it's called the Golden Bowl, is a wedding present that Charlotte gives to Maggie after a secret shopping trip with Amerigo, and the bowl, which is perfect except for a concealed flaw, becomes the object that inadvertently awakens Maggie to what is really going on. Maggie, by the novel's end, may have got her way, as her father and Charlotte are shipped off to the mythically named American City, where Adam's private museum of European artifacts will be used to educate the natives. So one of the key strands in my argument about this novel is that James is interested in how both imperialism and masculinity depend on understandings of desire as ornamentalist, as being enacted through an unstable iconography of ornamentation. James is often overwhelmingly figural, even campy, late style. If you've read any late James, you know it's pretty difficult going. Draws unsettling equivalences between a queer undoing of the masculine ornamental subject and ornament as a sign of imperial assimilation and the containment of otherness. So through a series of complementary, elaborate figures in the novel, including the eponymous Golden Bowl, James implicates the novel's own hypertactic style, its preference for recursive narration and complex syntax, in this doubled understanding of transatlantic masculinity. So here, given all that context, is the conclusion to my chapter on James's novel. What does Jamesian style want? David Koenig asks. Noting the tendency for characters and narrators in late James to speak in the same voice, Koenig makes a case for the character's enactment of a, quote, radically collectivist ethical imagination. In the Golden Bowl, not only do the characters tend to speak a similar Jamesian language and grammar, they also act out of respect for a style committed to the minimum of vibration. In this way, the unvoiced and ambiguous support of the principal male characters in the novel ensures the apparent success of Maggie's social architecture at the novel's end. if such an enactment of collectivity works through integration of the novel's more perverse imaginings of male desire into the family fold, then perhaps one could argue, like David Koenig, that the Golden Bowl seeks to formally realize an, quote, ethics of queer life, encouraging a, quote, interpretive agnosticism when faced with questions of sexual and identitarian truth. But the novel's collectivizing voice also suggests a less egalitarian mode of imaginary unification, a stylistic maintenance of Anglo-American cultural and racial identity under the threat of a seemingly inevitable decline by means of the careful infusion of other racial bloods and cultural experiences. That's a quote from Jonathan Friedman. Amerigo's reintegration and Adams' transporting of Charlotte to American City manage in this reading to attach a radical deconstruction of heterosexual domesticity to the mobilization of colonial discourse. So if analogy is the key means by which the novel asks us to link imperialism with desire, what is the cultural logic of Adams and Charlotte's future in American City? With Amerigo, the sexually magnetic Roman, accommodated once more within a superficially normal English domesticity, established by his secretly masochistic American wife, and with Charlotte, the erotically disruptive expatriate, returning to enact her imperial mission in a guise suggesting some sort of sexual slavery, what do these quasi-allegorical marriages tell us about empire's trajectory? These narrative endpoints suggest disorder and incoherence, seemingly at odds with the careful placement of what the verbers think of as human furniture. And yet these same messy analogies are, as the novel's opening pages have already mapped out, a return to the wandering yet pervasive ways in which empire makes itself reproducible. James, by a campy stylistic intensification, gives us imperial style and its availability to transatlantic dislocation writ large. In such a way, readers, like the characters of the Golden Bowl, repeatedly confront their incorporation into desire for and desire by a style, an ornamental style that precedes them. Imperialist style, James's novel suggests, is always already queer. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely amazing. A reminder to those individuals who are joining us today. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. In the meantime, as I was listening to you, it was absolutely fascinating. And when I look at the title, Queer Atlantic, and I guess what I'm wondering is do you find in your research major significant differences in this genre of literature between North America and, say, Europe, as an example?
I mean, the book takes into, it's focused on both British and American authors. And no, I don't think really in many ways, well, I mean, wow, that's a complicated answer, isn't it? Yes, I think there were definitely differences in terms of the kinds of, you know, immediate cultural context in which these novels are responding to. You know, Melville's very much concerned with thinking about, I think, sort of the long-term repercussions of something like the American Revolution. Robert Louis Stevenson is more so concerned, say, for instance, with the formation of Scottish nationalism in the early 19th century. So there are sort of, you know, distinct particular historical contexts that make these sometimes more nationally distinct, I guess. But I think the larger argument that the book kind of traces out is, in fact, they're actually taking part in a very kind of shared Anglo-American understanding of masculinity at this moment. So that, in fact, there's much sort of, you know, give and take across the Atlantic here with these authors, and that they're very much kind of writing into the same kind of imaginary space, I suppose.
And are you, I assume you're still working on various research right now. Are you thinking on perhaps a volume 2 of this type of material?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. The final chapter of the book kind of like is the sort of, probably should have been volume 2, but let's just make it a chapter instead, in which I kind of look forward to, you know, what did this body of work prepare for in the 20th century. And so in that chapter, I talk about sort of the ways in which some of the themes that come out in these novels sort of uncannily haunt the works of people like Claude Mackay, African-American novelist, James Baldwin, Juno Barnes, and also works by Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. That sounds like that could have been a book in its own right, but I decided no, I was done with that. But I have potentially thought about actually going in the opposite direction and writing the prequel. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that emerges at the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century, around the time of the American Revolution, that also sort of has this very strange erotic energy, kind of infusing the very kind of fraught nationalist politics at that moment. If I was to do that, it would probably in the end be more focused, I think, on sort of early American writing rather than sort of writing across the Atlantic. There's more of a body of it in that kind of early American literature.
I think that sounds fascinating. So we should all sit back and wait to see the prequel then, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Let's hope it doesn't ruin the original, right? Like Star Wars.
Definitely, if you do publish it, please let us know. We definitely will make sure that we get a copy in the library. So that sounds.
Just stay tuned for the next 7 years.
Understood. Well, thank you so very much. That was absolutely fascinating, and I have no doubt that everyone enjoyed it very, very much. And thank you so much for participating, and it was incredible to hear about your research. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Trudy.
Thank you. So next up, we have the next book that we're going to hear about, and I have it here. It's Health and Healthcare in Northern Canada. Another incredible title. All of the titles today are just amazing. And this particular book was edited by Dr. Rebecca Schiff and Dr. Helly Muller. Dr. Rebecca Schiff is a professor and chair in the Department of Health Sciences here at Lakehead University. Rebecca is a transdisciplinary researcher whose work focuses on determinants of community well-being, health equity, and social aspects of sustainability, with an emphasis on community-engaged methodologies, community co-generation of knowledge, and integrated knowledge translation. She has extensive experience in conducting community-engaged research and expertise in sustainable development and in rural, remote, and northern health and wellness. Also co-edited was Dr. Helly Muller, is an interdisciplinary health researcher and teacher with a background in medical anthropology and nursing. She is Danish in origin, and her training has taken place in both Denmark and Canada. Framed within a social justice perspective, Helly's areas of research and teachings span the determinants of health with an emphasis on the north. So this includes Northern Canada, Northern Ontario, Denmark, and Greenland, and with a particular attention to social justice. Helly joined the Department of Health Sciences here at Lakehead University in September 2011. And please join me in welcoming Rebecca and Helly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trudy. I'm just going to share my screen now. We have a short presentation, and mostly because we really want to highlight as well all of our contributors. We had many, many contributors to this volume, and want to make sure that we can highlight the important work that they did as well. But before I begin, I just want to acknowledge and say how grateful I am to live and work in the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation and in the Robinson Superior Treaty region. And just as I think I'll move on to a brief introduction to the book. The idea for this book emerged out of conversations that Helly and I had, where we saw that there were really no volumes that brought together research and knowledge on health and healthcare in Northern Canada, but that this was, a really important topic, that there was a lot of educational activity and research activity that focused on the North and health in the North. Another thing we feel is really important to acknowledge when we are talking about our book, and that we do so in the introduction to the book, is that any book on the North is inherently connected with Indigenous peoples. And so we always have felt that it was really critical to name our privilege as non-Indigenous white researchers in doing this book, But we also intentionally focused on bringing together chapter authors from diverse Northern and Indigenous communities. So that was really important to what we did, and why we didn't take the approach of doing a sole author book and instead of taking an edited volume approach. And we identify our positionality in the book, as do individual chapter authors. So overall, this book responds in part to the question, why a focus on Northern health and healthcare? Why did we take this focus? And so part of this response is a recognition of inequities that exist in Northern Canada, and inequities particularly that exist between across a north-south divide in this country. Another part of thinking about these inequities is recognizing that part of coming up with solutions is recognizing challenges. So we have a very strong focus in the book on being solutions oriented, on being strength and assets-based, or taking strengths and assets-based approaches to addressing challenges in the North. But part of coming up with solutions is understanding what the challenges are and what the strengths and resilience is that can respond to those challenges. So we organized the book into 3 sections. I won't talk too much more in terms of overview of the book, but section 1 is on social ecological dimensions of health and wellness, that really focuses on those dimensions of health and wellness and how health in the North is impacted by determinants of health. Section 2 focuses on healthcare systems, and section 3 on innovation and collaboration to achieve health equity. So I'm going to turn it over to Helly now, who's going to talk a little bit about COVID and how COVID impacted our work. Helly, you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. Imagine we've been on Zoom for 2 years and still I forget to unmute sometimes. But as Rebecca said, we did find that it was important to talk a little bit about COVID, because as the book was in the final stages, COVID hit. We were all hit, but not all equally. The determinants that impact inequity in health, well-being, and access to healthcare for people living in Canada's northern areas that the authors of this book are talking about were really significantly emphasized. This includes food and housing security, it includes income, it includes access to education, community infrastructure, kinship, and social ties, not to forget. It also includes more distal determinants of health, within which we can say that all the other determinants really are constructed. And those are determinants that are institutional, that are political, that are legal and cultural. And for Indigenous peoples, they also include histories of colonization, continued colonialism, racism, and social exclusion. And although we know really that a whole book could have been written about the impacts of COVID-19 in all of these areas, we're really hopeful that with this book, we provide an increasing focus on disparities between northern and southern communities in Canada. And hopefully that will help to, in some way, how small it might be, provide a positive impact on addressing those inequalities and inequities, and also then improve the determinants of health and well-being of people living in Northern Canada and Indigenous communities specifically. Northern Canada is predominantly Indigenous communities, although there are, of course, some people that are of non-Indigenous descent living there also. And that's really all I wanted to say about COVID. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Helly. So section 1 of the book is on social ecological dimensions of health and wellness in the North. And the first section of the book, this first section, deals with what we broadly defined as dimensions of health and wellness. And I'm just going to flip to the next slide, which contains all of the information about the various chapters that are included in this section, and the authors of those chapters as well. So, but for the purpose of this book and for this section, we define dimensions of health and wellness as accounting for both domains of health, so physical, emotional, social, mental, spiritual health, but also for the iterative and dynamic interactions between these domains, as well as between health and its determinants. So dimensions of health and wellness brings together domains of health, as well as the interactions with the various determinants of health. And we discuss also various ways of framing determinants of health. So social ecological determinants of health, also Indigenous social determinants of health, as well as particular expressions of health determinants that are unique to the North. So there are determinants that are more pronounced in Northern Canada, particularly related to issues such as housing, food security, employment, education, and so on, but also that there are some determinants that are in some ways unique to the North. So we might identify geography as a determinant of health in the North that isn't really identified so in other literature on health determinants. So I will now hand it over to Hele, who's going to talk a bit about section 2.
Thanks, Rebecca. Do you want to change the slide? Great. So in section 2, all the authors review some of the challenges that exist to providing the quality and quantity of care that is needed in northern remote communities, and highlight the need for educating health professionals close to home, and whether these are doctors, nurses, mental health professionals, or professionals providing perinatal care. And although what the authors describe is often based on case stories, they really highlight what northern peoples and communities, predominantly Indigenous communities, face. But as healthcare addresses already occurred illness in reality, and in reality is reactive, we also highlight the needs to address determinants, focus on innovative solutions that suit the needs of northern and remote residents, and enhance intersectoral and interprofessional collaboration to improve health and well-being and decrease the need for care, whether that is specialized or otherwise. Next slide, please. The challenges and subsequent solutions that authors focus on in this section span the healthcare needs across the continuum of human life, from birth to old age, and the impacts that the larger determinants put upon us, like colonization, continued colonialism, and climate change, and the impacts that this has on mental health and healthcare provision. And I just want to highlight that amongst the authors in this section, we're delighted to have another Lakehead faculty, Dr. Josephine Tan from the Department of Psychology. And I won't go into a lot of detail in each of the chapters because we simply don't have the time with 10 minutes. So I want to pass it on to Rebecca to talk a little bit about what we discuss and the authors discuss in section 3.
Thanks, Hele. So sections 1 and 2 really took a look at some of the challenges that are faced in the North that are framed by colonialism and a variety of other issues that continue to impact health status, as well as the determinants of health and healthcare systems, healthcare delivery in the North. And the chapters in section 1 and 2, many of them contain a focus on innovations and solutions. So the types of things that are being done to address those challenges. So for example, the first chapter in the book by Fiona Walton on education as a determinant of health also talks about some of the very innovative approaches that have been taken to providing educational opportunities, post-secondary educational opportunities and secondary educational opportunities for Inuit students in Inuit Nunangat, and for training healthcare providers as well. So, but section 3 really dives deeply into looking at solutions and innovations that are both present and what more is needed for the North and to ameliorate some of these health inequities. So this section fills in this final and critical piece on Northern health, with really a focus on the resilience of Northerners that they've demonstrated, and the innovation that they have inspired in the face of all of these social, economic, political, and environmental changes and challenges. So we have chapters in this section that focus on youth resilience, new frameworks for Northern mental health and addiction services. Again, and with all sections, there are additional faculty and students as well from Lakehead University who have made contributions. There are chapters that look at the evolving role of telemedicine and telehealth in the North, cultural safety, traditional healing, and how to do research in a good way in the North and with Northern Indigenous communities. And finally, the sort of very broad look at health policy and the way that legislation and federal and territorial and provincial health policy need to change in order to make healthcare and health more equitable for Northern communities.
In
So-
conclusion,
Go ahead, Hallie.
okay, thanks, Rebecca. So in conclusion, really, we hope that after having read the chapters in this book, that the reader will know that some of the most compelling issues that really profoundly are impacting Northerners is that old and new forms of colonial programs and political policies continue to create health and healthcare disparities in the North. The authors who contributed to the book stress how crucial it is that the future of Northern healthcare does not attempt to replicate Southern models, but rather respond to unique Northern context and embrace Northern strength. And the same is the case, for the determinants that impact health. This means that good and equitable healthcare in Northern Canada will likely look different in different communities, depending on their size, their geography, their culture, and their resources. It means that the future of Northern healthcare must be rooted in self-determination and the involvement of Northerners in directing the evolution of their healthcare system. But although healthcare might look different, equity in health and determinants of health really shouldn't, and that is strongly emphasized through all the chapters in the book. With that, we really would like to thank our funders that has made this work possible, and we want to thank our department for supporting us in the work, the university for supporting on this work, the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and Lakehead's Publication Assistance Fund. And with that, we say thank you to all of you for being here, and for the presenters that has preceded us and for the ones that come after. This is such an interesting session to hear about the work that people are doing. Thanks, everybody. Can't hear you, Trudy.
Sorry, that was amazing. Thank you both so much. I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A, and so just a reminder to those listening today, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in there. And I guess a question that I would put out to both of you, I was thinking about the concept of culturally appropriate health practices, and I suspect that you've possibly seen some good examples and possibly some not good examples, and if maybe you want to share some thoughts on that.
That's such a big topic. Hallie might want to say something as well, but one thing I'll say about culturally safe care is one of the directions where some of the thinking is moving now, and this doesn't cover everything, but is around anti-racism, that a first step in culturally safe care is addressing the racism that underlies us both at an individual level and also at a structural and systemic level. So we won't, in a lot of ways, we're sort of face barriers in terms of being able to do culturally safe care unless we address those underlying issues around racism and social exclusion and so on.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you for the question, Trudy. I think really when Rebecca talks about culturally safe care, what we need to do at this time is to look at the Truth and Reconciliation's calls for action, particularly in this particular context, the 7 that revolve around health and healthcare and education of healthcare professionals that are from Northern communities and will give their care back to Northern communities, and in this case specifically Indigenous communities. And that may mean that we support Indigenous communities in developing and designing and implementing programs that are more fitted to being serving the needs of Indigenous communities. The way that our educational systems are structured at this time really is not in support of many people that are from Indigenous descent ways of thinking and learning, and that creates a problem when you want to have an educated professional healthcare force. But it may also mean that we have to allow, it's such a contested way of putting it, that's not really what I mean, but Indigenous people should have the rights to draw on traditional knowledges also when healthcare is provided. And that's something that needs to be looked at legislatively. I mean, it's happening with midwives and it's happening in other arenas too, but there could be a lot more done in that regard.
That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you both very much. So I want to thank Rebecca and Hallie for sharing with all of us today your very important research, and thank you so much for participating. That was fabulous. Thank you. So the next book that we're going to be talking about and we're going to hear about today, so I'll move on to the next one. And the next book, as I hold in my hands, is Superhero Culture Wars, Politics, Marketing, and Social Justice in Marvel Comics. And it looks absolutely fascinating. And to tell you a little bit about the authors of this book was authored by Dr. Monica Fledgel and Dr. Judith Leggett. They're members of Lakehead University's English department. And Dr. Fledgel teaches cultural studies, Victorian literature, and children's literature. She has published articles and books on fan fiction, animals and Victorian culture, and child studies. Dr. Leggett teaches Indigenous literature and science fiction. She has published articles on Indigenous science fiction, tricksters in Indigenous literature, and Indigenous comics. Together, they have published a book chapter on racism in fan reactions to Marvel's all new, all different campaign. So today, they're going to be sharing with us some information on this incredible book, Superhero Culture Wars, Politics, Marketing, and Social Justice in Marvel Comics. I very much look forward to hearing about it. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Thank you everyone for coming out. And today I'm just going to give a brief overview of the book first of all, and then a small snippet. In our book, we examine how Marvel Comics has long presented itself and its comics, so both the corporation and the comics themselves, as politically liberal. This particular brand of corporate art has both indelibly shaped the company's in-world universe and its characters, and at the same time, and especially now, has made it vulnerable to conservative backlash. But throughout the company's history, this Marvel philosophy has also been at odds with its often contentious and exploitative relationship with comics creators, and also its fair weather commitment to inclusivity in its superhero stable. Our book focuses specifically on Marvel's proclaimed investment in diversity in the second decade of the 21st century. Through our analysis of the comics themselves, of Marvel's marketing strategies, and of discourse from fans, bloggers, and critics, we argue that Marvel's current successes and failures highlight the complexity of political art as a corporate brand. Our early chapters provide detailed readings of Marvel Comics' all new, all different Marvel campaign, in which many superheroes were supplemented or temporarily replaced by women or people of color. So in these chapters, we examine Miles Morales as Spider-Man, Kamala Khan as Ms. Marvel, Jane Foster as Thor, and Sam Wilson as Captain America.
So when that happened, a lot of fans were, very angry that their beloved superheroes were replaced by younger and often younger people and often people of color, and saw this as an attack on the comics community and on their nostalgic attachment to the original fans. Today, we're looking at probably the most controversial aspect of that entire campaign, which was Nick Spencer's 2017 Secret Empire event, which marked the end of the all new, all different campaign. So Steve Rogers retook his mantle after he had been replaced by his former partner, Sam Wilson. But that Sam Wilson 2015 title had met with a pretty mixed reception from fans. Many of them complained about what they saw as the too political storyline, which referenced the Black Lives Matter movement and focused on police violence against African-American community. In 2016, therefore, Marvel issued a press release and they announced that there would now be two Captain America titles, one for Sam Wilson and one that returned Steve Rogers to the role of Captain America, with Nick Spencer writing both. Spencer implied that these two books were for very different audiences with different ideas about the role of politics in comics. He said, if you're digging the topical, rip from the headlines approach we're taking in Sam's book, we've got plenty more of that to come. And if you're up for a more timeless take with Captain America facing off against Hydra and his classic rogues gallery, Steve's book will be just the thing for you.
But the return of Steve Rogers was quite different from how it was sold in this early press release. When Jesus Saiz's cover art for the first issue came out, it depicted a heroic looking Steve Rogers in front of the Capitol building in Washington under blue skies. However, this cover was hiding the reality. So at the end of this first comic, we have this now infamous image. of Steve Rogers, the Captain America, the Sentinel of Liberty, wearing trademark American colors under storm clouds, declaring "Hail Hydra," Hydra being the equivalent of the Nazis. Spencer constructs a history in which Steve has always been a secret agent for Hydra, this fictional fascist cult. His earlier promise that the book was aimed at those looking to tradition therefore reads as a rebuke of fan nostalgia. As blogger Manishtina explains, it's saying, hey, if you want to live in the modern world, here's Sam Wilson. But if you're one of those people steeped in the past, don't worry, we've got Steve Rogers, but you're kind of a racist bigot, so here's the Nazi Captain America you deserve. This assertion demonstrates how Marvel's choice to make a Hydra version of Captain America, especially one that so clearly embodies contemporary American white nationalism, can be read as an extension of the diversification of Marvel's superhero roster. So both the mantle passing and making the traditional hero into what's effectively a Nazi, critique those who defend racial and gender hierarchies in the name of tradition.
So Steve Rogers' exposure as a Nazi quickly became a subject of debate that reached far beyond comics readers and circles and provoked headlines, tweet storms, fan outrage. Many accused Marvel of using the real-world global shift towards right-wing extremism merely as a gimmick to sell comics. And Marvel's equivocations about the storyline, particularly their defense that it wasn't meant to be political, smacks of the discourse, one blogger complained, surrounding the use of the term alt-right to avoid calling a spade in real life. Nick Spencer, the author, further inflamed debate when he argued with fans about the ethics of punching white supremacists. He came out against it. And he claimed to the Daily Beast that he was the, quote, most hated man in America, a fact that he juxtaposed ironically with, and Donald Trump is running for president. So Spencer's linkage of these 2 points, the fictional retconning of a beloved American superhero and the all too real election of a reality TV show star for the American presidency, highlighted his own political liberal leanings and invited comparison between the plot of the comics and the volatile landscape of American politics at that time.
So the Captain America Steve Rogers image in which, Steve Rogers series in which this image appears and which explains the backstory, led into the major 2017 crossover event, Secret Empire, which was also written by Spencer. The storyline details how the Hydra version of Captain America seizes power and turns all of America into a Hydra state. The factors that allow him to do so all had obvious allegorical connections to current American politics. So we have a superhero community that is divided after debates over criminal profiling. We have the fear of an alien invasion, which leads to a barrier being built around the entire globe to separate Earth from imagined threats in the cosmos. And there's increasing tensions between the various groups of characters in the Marvel universe, between humans, superheroes, inhumans, and mutants. It's really difficult to read a comic book story about American citizens who are embracing the overthrow of their own government, in large part because of their respect for a charismatic leader who promises to restore a lost, glorious past, without seeing it as a direct engagement with American politics and a critique of the Trump slogan, "Make America Great Again."
So we would argue that you should not ignore those parallels and that we, in fact, defend the event, though it was much hated at the time, and say that it provides both compelling storytelling and a pretty complex exploration of contemporary politics. However, we do think that the marketing of the event, starting with that early press release for Captain America Steve Rogers, undermined the story's pretty important depiction of what makes states vulnerable to fascism and what is necessary to resist fascism. The series delves deeply into the question of public complicity in the rise of fascism and the fall of democracies, and the role that hero worship can play in winning citizens' consent for oppressive regimes, which is very timely at the moment. It also, through its depiction of the politics of memory in action, cautions its readership against the appeals to nostalgia, because all, of course, these attempts to revive an imagined and ideal past exclude many groups who do not fit with that narrative. Nevertheless, the ambiguity of some of the stories' allegorical connections suggest that Spencer, the writer, was not entirely in control of Secret Empire's narrative of fascism or the moral hazards associated with it. And definitely Marvel's handling of the public controversy surrounding the event further muddied the waters. So for us, we recognize that the current political turn in Marvel Comics is what makes Secret Empire relevant and necessary, but it also complicates Marvel's corporate brand. Marvel has always relied on a kind of safe liberal politics to address its old standby enemies of fascism and white supremacy. But Marvel is trying to please fans on both sides of current culture wars. So we argue that Marvel Comics, if it really wants to reflect the world outside its windows, which is its slogan, it's going to have to leave behind an apolitical corporate stance and storylines that are more neoliberal than they are actually progressive. Thank you.
That was amazing. I was listening very intently, and I confess I don't know that I'd really stopped to think about how that things that were happening in the culture were being infused into comics and superheroes, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, oh yeah, I'm picking up on that. So that was amazing. I guess a question that comes to mind is when I think over the last 2 years, two things when I think over the whole concept with COVID, and we've all been dealing with it for 2 years. And then the other thing, sadly and tragically, God forbid, the passing of Mr. George Floyd and everything that started. And so I guess my question is, do you anticipate in future comics that we're going to see those kinds of topics being infused into storylines?
I would say definitely. I'm not sure that I haven't been keeping up as much as I should with current comics. I'm not sure how much they've actually acknowledged COVID in current storylines.
That's a very good answer. Good question.
I think there definitely nods to the continuation of the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd's murder.
Marvel's always done this. Marvel is always well, I shouldn't say always, but if you go to the very beginning with Captain America, right, the invention, having Captain America punch Hitler might look now like a pretty, of course, everybody wants to punch Hitler, but at the time, for its Jewish creators, this was definitely a pretty strong nudge to say we need to get involved in this war that was seen by many as inappropriately political. Marvel commented on Nixon. Marvel commented on, civil rights movement. The Sam Wilson storyline very much it was about police violence and earlier Black Lives Matters iterations prior to George Floyd. The problem we analyze is that you have on the one hand creators who are very much into the political storyline, but then you have a larger corporation that is also the author that has its brand is progressive, but it also does things like censor. It was censored a variety of ways that they tried to keep people from making political statements, and so it's a difficult thing to negotiate.
Yeah. So, for example, in the first Secret Empire storyline, which is the one about Nixon, the writer said to the corporation, "No, this has nothing to do with Nixon." When they unmask the head of it and might say, "My God, that's not the president," but it obviously was the president. But in order to get it published by the corporation, they needed to hide it. Spiegelman was censored by Marvel in. It was an anthology he wanted to end it by very explicitly calling Trump Orange Skull, linking him to Red Skull, Captain America's Nazi opponent. And Marvel refused to include that. Marvel also wouldn't let us include any images in our book. I'm not sure if that was specifically about the content of the book or whether that was just corporate. We don't want to the corporate blanket, but it was when we sent them the write-up that they said, no, you can't have images. So So there is a certain amount of Marvel as a corporation not wanting to play both sides, wanting to be seen as progressive, seen as supporting the right causes, but at the same time not wanting those causes to be political in ways that they obviously and totally are.
Another question that was put forward is, do you look at how gender plays a role in these Marvel storylines? We'd love to hear about that.
We do that both with Jane Foster, most explicitly with Jane Foster, also with Kamala Khan, but we focus more on her as Muslim, but it also gendering in terms of her being a fangirl.
Yeah, what we noticed most was that fans objected most strongly when superhero mantles like Thor or Captain America that were traditional mantles were given to gender bent or race bent new characters. There's a long history of mantle passing in Marvel Comics. Many people have been Captain America. There have been many Thors prior, or at least some Thors, maybe not, there were many. But once you had a storyline that was like, a woman is now Thor, a black man is now Captain America, you know, a young black woman is Ironheart.
Ironheart. She didn't become Iron Man.
That seemed to make people collectively, you know, get anxiety. So we examine that anxiety and the sort of fear of replacement, and whether or not Marvel fed that.
Marvel deliberately fed that, I would say. The Jane Foster as Thor storyline, the first arc of it, the first 12 issues of it, aren't as good as most of the Jane Foster Thor storyline. The first one, we don't know who it is. It's just some woman who has become Thor, and it's all about her being a woman. And there's some really heavy-handed politics there, in which at one point, one of the female villains just basically turns on her male counterpart and gives both of them up to Jane Foster, to Thor, as a sort of girl power movement. And
that made people very angry.
That made people very angry because it was legitimately bad writing. But once Jane Foster got to be just Jane Foster as Thor, and brought in gender because she was a woman, but it wasn't her only identifier. So the first series, Jane Foster is Thor, and she's only a woman. In this later series, she's someone who's questioning the role of gods in humanity. She's someone who's dealing with cancer treatment. She's someone who's dealing with what it means to have power. She's dealing with how to be compassionate in the face of misogyny and in the face of injustice. So she's someone who has a much more complex and interesting storyline, but people still were angry at the time. They looked back,
they just saw that she was a woman.
Interestingly, people are looking back on those stories
and thinking they're good.
Which
is generally the case. A lot of these things are controversial at the time, and then they become the classics later on. So one of the things we're interested in is like, when is political storytelling done badly, and when is it done well, and how do we define that as, you know, aesthetically, as critics of, you know, comics as a genre.
Great, thank you. A question that comes to mind, and at this point, I think I'm going to be talking as a librarian, if you'll forgive me, is when I think, you know, the world that we live in, we're finding that balance between print and electronic, and this question might be outside the scope of your research, but I guess I'm wondering, how has the fact that the world has made that huge shift from print to electronics, how has that affected comics, or has it affected comics? Maybe comics are still being sold solely in print, I'm not sure. So I look forward to your thoughts on that.
There's a huge, you can go to like our Thunder Bay comic store and talk to the comic book owner and hear all about the publishing of comics is a weird and bizarre industry. I would say certainly moving online digitally has been huge in terms of opening it up, especially to younger audiences. It's a lot of younger audiences that want to read their comics streamed. We both have Marvel Unlimited, for better and worse. It is an extremely glitchy platform. But there is also this market that wants the floppies, and that tends to be an older traditionalist, real fans see themselves as owners of, you supporting the local comic book store, buying the floppy, and then there's younger fans, and there's a real generational divide that is sort of splitting the fandom.
And tied in with that generational divide, there is a perception that the middle-aged white male fan is the one who buys the floppies, the trade paperbacks, the ones which get sold to younger audiences, to less traditional comics audiences. So trade paperbacks, so something like Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel. I don't think it did quite as well in the floppies, but it did extremely well. It was a New York Times bestseller. So I think the first 4 trade paperbacks were all New York Times bestsellers. So they accounted differently too. And so one of the things that happens is people who focus only on sales of the floppies tend to point to, but people only ever read Spider-Man and Batman. That's going over to DC, but if you look at the top 10 in floppies, it's almost always 3 Spider-Man titles, 4 Batman titles, and assorted Avengers, Captain America, other Punisher, Wolverine, X-Men, comics that have been around for half a century at least.
And what started off this massive culture war that was called Comicsgate, which we don't want to get into because it's so awful, but there was one, who was it? He was the David Gabriel. He was head of marketing.
Yeah.
And he went to one comic summit and basically based on 3 or 4, two people saying diversity doesn't sell. He then said, oh, I guess diversity doesn't sell. And this is so that kind of gave force to all the traditional fans to say, look, there is no audience for this. Marvel is just making us read this stuff, when in fact there is an audience, but you have to trace it through digital sales. So your question is a really appropriate one.
Thank you. We do have a question in the Q&A, and I'll just read it to you. And the question is, in your research, have you noticed an increase in the amount of political censorship that Marvel Corporation has imposed in recent years compared to when they were smaller? Essentially, is there a marked increase in political risk aversion as the comic book market has become more mainstream? We look forward to your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of it has more to do with Perlmutter.
There's ebbs and flows, right?
Yeah.
So it depends on, like, at different times in Marvel Comics history, it has been more open to risk and then less open to risk. It did not comment on the Vietnam War practically at all. Like that was one thing that was really absent from its pages. So even though it was at that point marketing itself to a youth audience on campuses, like in the 1960s, it still was really risk averse to Vietnam. So it tends to not want to be on the side of debates that haven't been decided yet. And I think that sort of speaks maybe to its sort of liberal as opposed to really truly progressive, that it tends to be a little bit careful about politics that maybe there's still conflict and debate about. But yeah, I mean, and definitely at the top, we have Ike Perlmutter, who is really driving a lot of the decisions for Marvel in really negative ways. And it probably is behind a lot of the more overt censorship that's going on.
Yeah, though at the same time, I think they do recognize, there's Disney as well. Disney as a corporation really wants to brand itself as open, but open in a way that is universal.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the diversity pushes are diversity pushes that rely on a deep down, we're all the same kind of narrative, which is far more palatable than actually dealing with structural systemic racism and other such things, the influx of Nazis into politics. Yeah, these are harder things to deal with, the things that really are at the hood of a lot of comics narratives.
Yeah.
And so there is that sneaking it in through the stories in ways that the corporations might not notice.
Thank you. Well, and thank you for all of the information that you've shared this morning on your book, and thank you for answering all the questions so well. So we appreciate that. So thank you very much. So I guess we're getting to the close of our session this morning. And so in closing, what I'd like to say, there's a few things that's very important to pass on. First and foremost, I'd really like to thank the panelists today. So a very warm, sincere thank you to Dr. Charles Lefko, Dr. Daniel Hanna, Dr. Rebecca Schiff, Dr. Hallie Muller, Dr. Monica Fledgel, and Dr. Judith Leggett. We could not have done this without you. Your research is phenomenal. And I think that I have no doubt that everyone who attended today really enjoyed hearing about all the research that you've completed. So thank you. I'd also like to thank our university librarian, Mr. Robin Canuel. He's our university librarian here in the library. And Robin and I actually started talking about this back in October. And so we've been talking about this for quite a long time. And he's been extremely supportive and extremely helpful in this entire project. So Robin, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'd also like to extend a very sincere thank you to Sheena Allard. Sheena works as the Research Ethics and Events Coordinator, and I couldn't have done it without her. She has been so patient answering all of my questions, and she's been there from the beginning, and she's been wonderful, so thank you. And also a quick shout out to Rusty Brown. That's the individual who created our marketing poster, and it turned out beautiful, and I appreciate that as well. So in closing, what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank all of the attendees today. I know how busy everyone's day is. Everybody's juggling, for sure. And we very much appreciate you coming today. So thank you to everyone. I appreciate it. And I wish everyone a great day. Thanks very much.